In 1957, Bill and Daisy Myers did what millions of American families were doing in that era. They bought a house in the suburbs. And not just any suburb. They moved to Levittown just outside of Philadelphia. In so many ways, they were the quintessential post-war American family. Bill was a World War II vet who worked as a technician at a lab where he earned a middle-class income to support his wife and 3 children. But there was one hitch. The Myers were African American. As soon as they moved in, huge mobs gathered nearly every day outside their home, shouting racial slurs and pelting the house with rocks and bricks. On the lot next door, someone put out a Confederate flag and lit a burning cross. And the police? They showed up, but did next to nothing. No one was ever arrested. And after 4 long years, the Myers family gave up. They sold their dream house in Levittown and moved back to the predominantly black neighborhood they'd previously lived in. The American dream was alive and well in post-war America, just not for everyone. You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
to huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hi there, everyone. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode 46, in which we look at the history of the federal government's role in promoting racial segregation in the 20th century. We are coming to you this week from the Pruitt-Igoe Studios, located on the campus of Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com. and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and our new YouTube channel. Keeping the chaos to a minimum is our splendid executive producer, Lulu Spencer. Well, I hope you all had a delightful Thanksgiving holiday. We sure did on this end. Lots of family food and football. But now it's back to reality. For those of us who work at colleges and universities, we've got about 2 weeks of classes remaining in the semester, followed by a week of final exams and final papers. And then it's Christmas break. But it's important not to get ahead of ourselves. As the great poet Robert Frost once wrote, "I have miles to go before I sleep." So what's up this week at In the Past Lane? Well, last week we focused on the Pilgrims in the early 1600s. This week we jump ahead 4 centuries to the mid-20th century to look at the history behind the unending problem of racial segregation in American society. I'll speak with scholar Richard Rothstein about his book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. As you'll soon hear, he lays out in great detail some uncomfortable truths about the history of racial segregation. First, that racial segregation was everywhere in 20th century America, not just in the Jim Crow South. And second, and here's the key, most of it was due not to poverty, nor the personal preferences of individuals to live with people of their own race. Nope. It turns out the single most important factor driving racial segregation in 20th century America was the federal government. That's right. It's largely driven by explicit government policy that mandated the separation of people by race. And third, Rothstein shows us that these pro-segregation policies, perhaps more than anything else, have perpetuated African American poverty and increased the wealth gap between white and black Americans. It's not a pretty story, people, but it's one we need to know if we truly believe in the idea of forming a more perfect union. Okay, people, pay no attention to white or yellow lines. We're looking for redlining on this trip. Your journey in the Past Lane begins now. All right, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, back here at In the Past Lane. And with me now is Richard Rothstein. He is a research associate at the Economic Policy Institute and a fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He's also a fellow at the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. Richard Rothstein is with me today because he's recently published a new book, The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. Richard Rothstein, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, I'd like to have you start off by talking about what seems to me is the primary goal of your book, which is to take on a fundamental assumption in American life, a very comforting assumption, a myth really, about segregation. And that is that the segregation that's persisted since the Civil Rights Movement and still persists today throughout America is entirely de facto segregation. That is, according to the myth, it's not segregation mandated by law, which is something called de jure segregation. Rather, it's de facto segregation, which essentially means segregation that just sort of happened, for reasons that have nothing to do with public policy or law. Can you tell our listeners more about this myth and who buys into it?
Yes, it's not only the public and politicians, it's also Supreme Court justices who have this view that every residential neighborhood in this country, every residential area in this country is segregated by race for reasons that have nothing to do or very little to do with public policy. And they call it de facto segregation, which is the result of private discrimination, perhaps rogue real estate agents steering white families to white neighborhoods and black families to black neighborhoods, or perhaps because of people's choices of wanting to live with same-race neighbors, or perhaps because African Americans have incomes that are lower than whites and therefore they can't afford to live in middle-class neighborhoods. All of these causes of residential segregation, which, as I say, exists everywhere in the country, all of these causes are not the result of government policy, and therefore they are not constitutionally remediable, because under the theory that the Supreme Court has advocated and insisted upon, if we have de facto segregation, the result of all of these private actions, there's no constitutionally permissible remedy for it. If, on the other hand, we had de jure segregation by government policy, law and policy, explicit, racially purposeful policy to segregate neighborhoods, then not only would we be permitted to desegregate, but we'd be required to implement policies to desegregate neighborhoods. And what I write in this book is that, in fact, the de facto segregation myth hobbles our ability to remedy it, because the reality is that the residential segregation of every metropolitan area in this country was created by racially explicit, purposeful government policy designed to create residential segregation. And it's a history that was practiced throughout the 20th century, that was well known when it was being practiced, but that's been largely forgotten. And because we've forgotten this history, we have adopted a myth of its opposite.
Right. And that seems that what your intent to do in this book is to really to detail the many, many ways. It's not just one set of policies. It's tax policy. It's federal housing policy. It's a whole wide range of federal and state government organizations that have put out policies that collectively they have created this system of government-sanctioned segregation. So where do we begin to understand, what are the first big programs that start this federally sanctioned segregation problem or set it in motion?
Yes, but first let me respond to what you just said by saying that you're absolutely right. This was many, many policies, and that's one of the reasons why we've forgotten the history, because it's not a single policy. It's not like school segregation in the South, which was unconstitutional because it was the product of single laws adopted by state legislatures. Residential segregation is a result of many policies that were just as explicit, just as unconstitutional as school segregation in the South. But it was a question of many policies interacting and reinforcing each other that created this residential pattern. So where do we begin? Well, I think there are many places to begin, but perhaps the most powerful first policy, not the first one, but the most powerful first policy, was the New Deal's public housing program. Now, we often think of public housing, most of us do think of public housing as a place where poor people live, a place of minorities, single parents with children, lots of unemployment, lots of hopelessness among young men who then act out and invoke police response and repressive response. That's our image of public housing. In fact, that's not how public housing began. Public housing for civilians began during the New Deal. It was one of the first programs enacted by the Franklin Roosevelt administration in 1933. The Public Works Administration began to build civilian public housing primarily for middle-class white families, working-class white families. These were families not who were too poor to afford housing, but who were homeless during the Depression. It was also a way of stimulating construction activity, employment in the Depression. And the federal government, the Public Works Administration, built public housing during the Depression that was segregated everywhere in the country, not in the South, but in the North, the Midwest, the West, as well as the South, explicitly segregated, frequently segregating neighborhoods that had never known segregation before and creating patterns of segregation that hadn't previously existed, or if some segregation existed, reinforcing that segregation.
Right. You talk about the example of Langston Hughes as a representative example of just how this operated. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. In his autobiography, The Big C, Langston Hughes describes how he spent his adolescence in an integrated Cleveland neighborhood. He says that his best friend was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. Integrated neighborhoods like that were commonplace in metropolitan areas, in urban areas in the mid-20th century. Much more integration then than we have today, simply because working families didn't have automobiles with which to get to work. And so they had to live in neighborhoods that were close enough to their workplaces where they could walk. And so if you had a factory downtown which employed workers of different ethnicities and races, you had to have neighborhoods where all of those workers lived together. So you had neighborhoods of Polish workers, of Irish immigrants, of Italian immigrants, of Jewish immigrants, of rural migrants from areas outside the cities, and of African Americans all living in integrated neighborhoods. Well, the Public Works Administration came into that Cleveland neighborhood where Langston Hughes had been an adolescent, demolished tenement housing there, and built two separate projects, one for African Americans, one for whites, creating segregation in a part of Cleveland where it hadn't previously been known, and reinforcing whatever tendencies towards segregation were developing in Cleveland at that time. Those patterns exist to this day, those patterns of residential segregation, and this went on all across the country. In my book, I like to talk about places like San Francisco and Cambridge, Massachusetts, because they're known as liberal areas in this country, and I think that readers can probably understand that if it happened in San Francisco, it happened in Cambridge, it happened throughout the country. Well, in Cambridge, the federal government also demolished an integrated neighborhood during the New Deal. It was half black, half white, and built separate projects, one for blacks, one for whites, in that neighborhood. I want to emphasize this is not indirect effects of benign policies. It's not that African Americans happen to choose one project and whites happen to choose to apply to another project. These were explicitly designated, segregated projects. And the reason I call my book A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America is because this was no hidden mystery. It was out in the open.
Right. So the starting point is during the New Deal. But then comes World War II. So how does this accelerate the trend of government-sanctioned segregation?
Well, the next thing that happened after the initial civilian housing that was built during the New Deal was during World War II, we had hundreds of thousands of workers, both African American and white, flocking to centers of war production for jobs. And the growth of these centers of war production was so rapid that the federal government had to build housing for them. I gave an example of, in the book, I talk about Richmond, California, across the bay from San Francisco, which was the center of shipbuilding on the West Coast. The Kaiser shipyards were there. Richmond, California before World War II, was a town of about a little bit less than 20,000. There were very few African Americans living there. A few were working as domestic servants in white households. But it was basically a white community. By the end of World War II, the population of Richmond had grown to nearly 100,000. It's unimaginable, really, how a community can grow from 20,000 to 100,000 in a 4-year period. But if the government wanted to keep the shipbuilding lines going, it had to create housing for these workers who were flocking to Richmond. And so it did. It built segregated public housing in Richmond. African American housing was built along the railroad tracks near the shipyards. Housing for white workers was built in the residential areas further inland, creating a segregated pattern where it had never been known before. There had been no segregation before in that area, and the segregation persisted until today. Well, after World War II, there was enormous civilian housing shortage still, both because no housing had been created during the Depression and because during the war, construction materials were prohibited for use in civilian uses. It could only be used for war effort. And so there's this big backlog of housing. The federal government vastly expanded its public housing program, primarily through the 1949 Housing Act, and built the high-rise towers that we came to associate with public housing. But these were high-rise towers, again, for working families, for families who could afford not to be subsidized. The purpose was not to house poor people. The purpose was to house people without housing, returning war veterans, for example. And so the federal government built giant projects. Probably the iconic one was the Pruitt-Igoe Towers in St. Louis. Well, what most people have forgotten is that this was initially two projects. The Pruitt Towers were for African Americans. The Igoe Towers were for whites, explicitly so, creating a segregated environment in that public housing in St. Louis. But then shortly after the projects were built in the mid-1950s, large numbers of vacancies began to develop in the Igoe projects, which had been designated for whites, and long waiting lists for the African American project, for the Pruitt project. And this again went on in public housing all across the country. Large vacancies in the white projects, long waiting lists for the black projects. Eventually, the federal government and local housing agencies, this became so conspicuous that these agencies had to open up all the projects to African Americans. Projects became filled with poorer and poorer people because industry left the central cities at the same time.
That's right. There's other trends that are sort of intersecting with this, like deindustrialization.
That's right. And so the public housing then began to be filled not with working families, but with unemployed families, with single mothers, the kind of public housing that we come to associate with its stereotype today. Well, the question that I'm sure arises when you hear this story is, how did and why did all these vacancies develop in the white projects and not in the black projects? And that was the result primarily of another federal program, another racially explicit federal program by another New Deal agency, the Federal Housing Administration, which had been created in 1934, the year after the Public Works Administration. And the Public Housing Administration in the 1940s and early 50s began to subsidize the creation of suburbs, large suburbs surrounding every metropolitan area, on condition that these suburbs be exclusively white, that no African Americans be permitted to live there. And I want to emphasize this was an explicit condition. This is not the implicit effect of a benign policy. The Federal Housing Administration created these suburbs explicitly on a whites-only basis. So perhaps the best known of these is Levittown.
Out on Long Island?
Out on Long Island, yeah, east of New York City in Nassau County. William Levitt, the builder, could never have assembled the capital to build 17,000 homes, for which he had no buyers at that time. The only way he could assemble the capital to construct Levittown was by taking his plans for the subdivision to the Federal Housing Administration. The plans he had to submit to the Federal Housing Administration were detailed in terms of the design of the homes, the street layout of the suburb, every conceivable detail of the architecture, the construction materials that would be used, and get the approval of the Federal Housing Administration for those plans. And he could then take those plans to banks to get construction loans on a guaranteed basis because the Federal Housing Administration was guaranteeing them. Well, one of the conditions that the Federal Housing Administration placed on approval of these plans was that no homes be sold to African Americans, and further, the FHA required that Levitt place in the deed of every home in Levittown a clause prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. And again, this was not just true of Levittown. It was true of suburbs in every metropolitan area of the country. Some of your listeners may remember hearing a song Pete Seeger used to sing. It was written by Malvina Reynolds about houses on a hillside.
Ticky-tacky.
Ticky-tacky, yeah. And they all look the same. Well, that was about a development south of San Francisco called Daly City, which was also FHA financed on a racially exclusive basis. The great growth of the southwest of Los Angeles, the big symbol of suburbanization in the 1950s, suburbs like Lakewood, south of Los Angeles, or Panorama City in the San Fernando Valley, all FHA subsidized developments on condition that no homes be sold to African Americans. So these two programs work together. Public housing program concentrated African Americans, increasingly low income in urban areas as the jobs left there, and the Federal Housing Administration subsidization of white-only suburbs created white suburbs surrounding those metropolitan areas, what policymakers in the 1960s began to call a federally constructed white noose around African American neighborhoods in urban areas.
That's a grim but, I guess, apt name for it. And I think it's important to point out this point, that this massive suburbanization trend that started after World War II didn't just happen. You know, there's a popular narrative that suggests that World War II helps end the Great Depression and that following the war, Americans have money and they buy new automobiles. And so they somehow just naturally, move to the suburbs. But in reality, if we view it from 30,000 feet, we can see that suburbanization is the product of all sorts of government programs, like building a massive highway system. And as Kenneth T. Jackson, my graduate school advisor and author of Crabgrass Frontier, a famous book on the history of suburbanization, he always points out that cheap gasoline plays a key role as well. So there's a whole bunch of government programs that are promoting suburbs. They're not just happening as some sort of natural outgrowth of mid-20th century American life. Well, another figure you profile in your book is the famous author Wallace Stegner and his attempt, as part of a large group of aspiring homeowners, to build affordable housing for working class and lower middle class families in post-war California. And it's a great plan, except for one thing. It violates the FHA's strict rules on segregation. Could you tell our listeners a little bit more about this revealing saga?
Right. Wallace Stegner. He was a great American novelist. He eventually won a Pulitzer Prize for a book he wrote later called Angle of Repose. But prior to World War II, he had written an autobiographical novel called Big Rock Candy Mountain. And on the basis of that book, Stanford University recruited him to teach writing at Stanford University. And at that time, Stanford professors were not paid the unconscionable, exorbitant salaries that they're paid today. Wallace Stegner was just a working-class college professor who came to Palo Alto and couldn't find housing because there was an enormous civilian housing shortage at the time. And other working-class, lower middle-class families also couldn't find housing. So Wallace Stegner joined and helped lead a cooperative. Initially of about 150 families. It was designed to grow to 400 families. And they purchased a large tract of land, a ranch, outside Stanford University with the plan of building 400 modest middle-class homes on that property. And they hired an architect. They had a builder beginning to clear land for the development. But Stegner and his cooperative could not get bank loans to finance the construction of this development. And the reason they couldn't get bank loans is because the Federal Housing Administration prohibited banks from lending to the cooperative. And the Federal Housing Administration's reason was that this cooperative of 150 families had 3 African-American families in its membership. And the Federal Housing Administration refused to guarantee loans for a development that included African-Americans. Well, some of the members of the cooperative wanted to try to compromise with the FHA, so they adopted a resolution that promised that the percentage of African Americans in the development would never exceed the percentage of African Americans in the state of California. The FHA refused that compromise. They had an all-or-nothing position. Any African Americans would make the development ineligible for federal guarantees. As a result, the cooperative disbanded, sold its land to a private developer who got an FHA loan to develop a suburb there on condition that every home have a restrictive covenant prohibiting African Americans from living there. And the cooperative was not able to go ahead with building its integrated development.
Right. So these restrictive covenants are clearly a key piece in this story. But African Americans and civil rights organizations like the NAACP, they file lawsuits to challenge the constitutionality of restrictive covenants. And one of these cases eventually makes it to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1948.
Well, restrictive covenants were clauses that were usually attached either to individual home deeds or, more often, a compact enacted by a neighborhood association that enabled any homeowner in that association to sue to have an African American evicted if that African American bought a home in the neighborhood. This was actually, I should say, it was quite common for African Americans to buy homes in white neighborhoods, especially those adjoining urban areas, because African American housing was in such short supply, partly because of private discrimination, that African Americans were willing to pay much, much more for housing than whites would pay for similar housing, because their supply of housing was so much smaller. The result was that if a white family in a borderline area wanted to sell its home, it was to its advantage to sell to an African American, not to a white.
Unless, of course, there was a restrictive covenant involved. Then what happened?
So if there was a restrictive covenant in those neighborhoods, white families in the neighborhoods could sue to have the African American evicted if a white family sold to the African Americans in violation of the restrictive covenant. And there were thousands of these cases across the country of suits to evict African Americans, and almost all of them were upheld, and African Americans were forced to leave. I talk in The Color of Law about a family in Berkeley, California, a doctor in Berkeley, California, who bought a home in a white neighborhood in Berkeley and who got a court order of eviction because he bought in violation of the restrictive covenant. Well, eventually in 1948, the Supreme Court said that it was unlawful to use the courts to enforce a restrictive covenant. It didn't find the restrictive covenants themselves unconstitutional.
Right, because they were considered private contracts.
Right, but they prohibited courts from enforcing them. But even though that 1948 decision was issued, covenants continued to be enforced because what many neighborhood associations and developers did is they transformed the covenants from a requirement that the family be evicted to a requirement that the seller pay a penalty to his neighbors, and frequently the penalty was of higher value than the value of the home itself. I mentioned before Daly City, south of San Francisco. The covenants in Daly City didn't permit the eviction of African Americans. It permitted homeowners in the surrounding area to sue the seller for damages, and the damages exceeded the value of the home. So it was an effective prohibition on selling to an African American. That went on after the 1948 decision. But the point I make in the book is that the Supreme Court found in 1948 that it was unconstitutional for courts to enforce restrictive covenants. But that doesn't mean that it was constitutional before 1948 to do so. This entire period when courts were enforcing restrictive covenants was a violation of the Constitution. Just as many of us today, I think very few of us today, let me say it this way, very few of us today think it was constitutional to segregate schools before 1954. We understand that the Supreme Court's decision only recognized what it should have recognized long before. And likewise, the 1948 decision of the Supreme Court only recognized the unconstitutionality of court enforcement of these covenants, which were always unconstitutional.
And there's another piece to this story, and that's the role of tax-exempt status for private nonprofit organizations like large universities. And the one you profile in your book is the University of Chicago. It's a private nonprofit organization that enjoys tremendous economic benefits from being granted tax-exempt status by the federal government, and yet it's engaged in a full-on effort to prevent African Americans from moving into its section of Chicago. Tell us more about that.
Yes, I talk about Robert Hutchins, who was the president and chancellor of the University of Chicago from the late 1930s to the early 1950s, and he's well known among educators today. He was a prominent theorist of higher education in efforts to raise the quality of higher education in the United States. Robert Hutchins maintained an office in the University of Chicago of lawyers whose job it was to sue to have African Americans evicted from homes they bought in the neighborhood of the University of Chicago in an attempt to keep that neighborhood all white. Now, the University of Chicago is a tax-exempt institution. There was nothing secret about the University of Chicago's efforts. The presence of University of Chicago lawyers in these court cases was well known. They weren't using fronts. So it was a violation of the Constitution and of the Internal Revenue Code for the IRS to grant tax exemptions to institutions like the University of Chicago that were openly practicing segregation. I'm not talking about this being a minor thing that they may have done, the sub rosa. This was an open practice in the University of Chicago. Many of the restrictive covenants that I mentioned earlier were based in local churches, tax-exempt churches. The 1948 case that you talked about, the plaintiff trying to sue the homeowner for selling to an African American was the local church. And this was commonplace all across the country. It was very open, not secret at all. Churches were in the forefront of this effort because many of these churches were ethnic churches. And they wanted to maintain the ethnic population of their immediate neighborhoods, so they wanted to keep out African Americans. But again, this was a violation of the IRS's constitutional and legal obligation. In 1980, you may recall, there was a Supreme Court case in which the IRS withdrew the tax exemption of Bob Jones University. And the reason was that Bob Jones University prohibited interracial dating for its students. Clearly, the IRS recognized its responsibility not to grant tax exemptions to institutions that practiced racial discrimination. It considered a violation of its Fifth Amendment responsibilities, of its legislative responsibilities, to grant such a tax exemption. But in the entire 20th century, the IRS never lifted the tax exemption of a university or a church or a hospital or other nonprofit institution that enforced segregation or was a leader in the enforcement of segregation in its immediate neighborhood. So this, too, was a violation of the Constitution and created one of the contributing pieces of de jure segregation that created the residential landscape we have today.
Indeed. Well, I think this is a really good place to turn our attention to really a crucial aspect of this story of government-mandated segregation, and that's the economic ramifications of segregation. I mean, it's really important to emphasize that segregation isn't just unfair, because it prevents some people from living in certain neighborhoods. Segregation has an enormous economic dimension to it. Because it's after World War II with the GI Bill and so many other programs, that's where the American middle class as we know it is minted. Millions and millions of people, or to be more precise, white people, gain access to all kinds of programs and opportunities to build wealth, which they then can pass on to their children. And a lot of that wealth, probably a majority of it, is the product of home ownership. And it seems that this is a key to explaining the tremendous disparity between African American families' personal wealth and white American families' personal wealth. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yes, I think you said it very well. The reason that this history is so important is because it determines a lot of the residential landscape that we have today, racially segregated. It's not a historical curiosity only. It's something that has never been remedied and that still is powerful today, and you just explained why. Take the families that bought homes in Levittown or in Daly City or in any of these other suburbs in the mid-20th century. Levittown, for example, small, modest home, 750 square feet. They sold in the mid-20th century for $8,000, $9,000, $10,000. Yeah. In today's money, that's about $100,000 or less, maybe $90,000, about twice national median income. A working-class family, a returning war veteran without skills, can afford to buy a home for twice national median income. My uncle bought a home in Levittown. He was a grocer, worked in a grocery store, stocking vegetables. He was not a highly paid professional, but he could buy a home in Levittown for less than $90,000 in today's dollars with his VA status. Well, today those homes in Levittown sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, and the same is true in these other suburbs around the country. That's 6, 7, 8 times national median income. They're no longer affordable to working-class families of any race. So we passed a fair housing law in 1968 that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, now you can buy homes in Levittown.
Right.
But it's an empty promise because the homes are now unaffordable. African Americans who were prohibited in the mid-20th century from living in the suburbs, were locked in urban areas, paying rent, gained none of that appreciation that white families gained. Today, nationwide, African American incomes are about 60%, or 60% of white incomes. African American wealth is about 7% of white wealth. Yeah. And that enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 7% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy as practiced in the mid-20th century. The white families who gained that wealth bequeathed it to their children. They used it to pay for their children's college educations. They used it to subsidize their own retirements. They used it for medical emergencies.
Yeah, emergencies. And that's another stat that's out there these days. How many people can come up with $400 overnight? It's a really small number.
That's right. And the white families who were able to do that had a level of economic security that African Americans have not had. If they had those kinds of emergencies, they had to dip into income if they had it or go without taking care of the emergency. They couldn't send their children to colleges. And so the consequences of this unconstitutional housing policy remain with us today. And unless we understand the history of how it was created by government policy, not by accident, not by private choices, we're not going to be in a position to understand the constitutional obligation to remedy it.
And that aligns perfectly with something I always say to my students and to listeners of this podcast, that history is the study of choices. And these choices we've been talking about today regarding segregation are a great example of this idea. These policies and these outcomes didn't just happen. As your book shows, they're the result of a series of key public policy choices that led to those outcomes. And so this leads to another important question. What do we do about this problem?
Well, the first thing that needs to be done is to acquaint Americans with this history. It would be foolish of me to talk about remedies. They would seem to be completely impractical, politically unrealistic. And I do talk about some remedies in the book as examples of the kinds of things that could be done.
But step one is
to acquaint Americans with this history. For example, in The Color of Law in the book, I describe how I went through every commonly used American history textbook in the country at the present time. And the most widely used one is called The Americans. It's 1,200 pages. In those 1,200 pages, one paragraph is devoted to segregation in the North. Within that paragraph, one sentence is devoted to residential segregation, and the sentence reads, in the North, African Americans were forced into segregated neighborhoods. Passive voice sentence. Mm-hmm. No indication whatsoever of who did the forcing. African Americans woke up one day, looked out the window and said, look, we're in a segregated neighborhood. Well, if we continue to teach our young people this myth that it was de facto segregation, it is de facto segregation, the next generation is going to be as little prepared to deal with this problem and to remedy it as our generation has been. So I think the first thing we need to do is to reacquaint Americans with this forgotten history so that there can be a policy consensus, at least, that we need to do something about it and that we have the constitutional power to do something about it.
Yes, that's true. There's a lot we can learn from history, especially the idea that, the bad choices of the past can be undone by better choices of the present and the future. That's a really important message. Well, Richard Rothstein, it's been a pleasure to speak with you about your new and really timely book, The Color of Law. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Richard Rothstein is author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, published by Liveright.
If you are enjoying this podcast, then please subscribe to In the Past Lane at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access your podcasts. Subscribing is free, and once you do it, new episodes of In the Past Lane are automatically downloaded to your listening device. Subscribing also gives you access to the entire back catalog of In the Past Lane episodes. And if you do subscribe, please leave a review. Thanks.
Well, citizens, we've reached the end of this episode of In the Past Lane. Thanks for listening. Let me know what you think of this episode and this podcast. Send your comments, questions, and suggestions along via Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Please also leave a starred review, even just a sentence or two, at Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. Reviews are really helpful for attracting new listeners. Thanks. If you want to learn more about this episode's topic, you'll find it at our website, inthepastlane.com. There you'll find a show page that has recommended readings, links, and show credits. Thanks to all the terrific people who make In the Past Lane possible. Thanks also to the Free Music Archive, which supplied most of the music for this episode. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world, so let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the Past Lane. Hey, Lulu, I was thinking maybe we should talk about your future here at In the Past Lane.
Funny. I was thinking the opposite.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.